Good morning, good evening, good day, greetings with a helping side of salutations and welcome to the Safe Room featuring Security Side Quest. My name is Tristan, Watty, and thank you for joining me today as we continue our epic security journey. As always, say hello to producer Jeff. He's your favorite producer and mine. And as always, feel free to jump into the chat and let us know what you're thinking about. Or where you're coming in from, where you're dialing in from. And while you do that, I'll take the second to reintroduce myself the proper way because I'm Tristan Watty and I come to you from the Professional Services Division of AWS, where we help to accelerate customers' journey to the cloud in a secure manner, fashion, form, and way. And usually I'm joined by Russ Noll from the CERT team. But today we will continue to solo because, you're never really alone, especially when you have chat. So feel free to say hi, chat, and haha, H-A-H-A, and everything in between that, because we have two icebreaker type questions. What is the second one? Well, it's an easy one, but one that, causes some stir because it is, what is your favorite pizza topping? And I already lost one heart just thinking about mine because it is a lot of hot sauce and pepperoni, but not too weird, not too out there. But the hot sauce, it can vary depending on, how I feel that day. So let me know what yours is. What keeps you up and running, especially when you're trying to think of what re-energizes your own self. As I segue into this other topic that we love to speak about, which is AWS security. And this episode is an interesting one. Not only because Ari likes cheese, if it includes bacon, but because we are kind of speed running through our entire season. It's interesting. We covered a lot of ground since January. So where do we begin? As always, with some pineapple. 10 billion points to you if you get that reference. It's a really deep cut from a really old episode. But thank you, Del, for sharing that. I think the place to start off, to think about how you speed run. There's the inside joke of what is any percent. Any percent means you just got to complete it. And that's usually the challenge when it comes to security, is there's sometimes decision paralysis where, hey, what can you do within your own organization, within your environment to make some steady progress, some short-term wins, some long-term wins, and everything in between? Well, it's just starting out with an architectural design, starting out with some fundamentals. What is your world 1-1? What are the foundational stages that you're trying to get to? How do you go from governance from greenfield to guardrails? How do you go from locking down identity to data in a world 1-2? While I also say, hello, Victor. Always nice to see you. So I think that's kind of where you start to formulate what's on your brain, what's in your mind, and try to understand, hey, I have a lot of things that I need to think about, especially when it comes to coming up with your speed run strategy, your strat, when it comes to implementing the security. And part of that is dividing all of these different pieces into little bite-sized chunks. I like to say breaking it down to the ones and zeros. So if you take something like logging detection and automated response, that's one little chunk. And I use that in a comical way because logging is usually a big actual topic to speak about. I call it the encounter loop, right? Is if you played any game where you have encounters randomly spawning, that's logs. They're randomly coming in. It's like, okay, access, no access, key, no key. And how do you exactly deal with all these logs? We spoke about in early episodes, if I had 10 billion events, how do I get that to one detection? How do I get that to one trigger? And how slow storage operates. That is also an interesting thing because if you're getting inundated by logs, you're saying, hey, what is happening within my environment? What's happening within my instance? Right? And part of that, to close out the cycle, you want to think about your victory lap. I know it seems far-fetched right now, but when you start to go through and just try to complete your security journey so you can iterate on it. That's the most important part, is you are setting up the guardrails, the boundaries. You're not trying to get exactly perfect because that leads to the decision paralysis. But if you take in, some known security patterns, you can start to build and grow your organization. It's little things. And as Dell mentions, certificates and OpenID Connect implementation are probably common themes. Yes, that is also an interesting thing, because when you have AWS organization, if we go off on this little tangent and this little, side quest, you start to think about, all right, I have this current structure. I have all these identities. How does this implement into my AWS organization? And one of the key aspects that I see organizations kind of have a lot of back and forth with, especially during migrations, is users are used to having a certain level of access. But are they supposed to have all that access, especially when they migrate to the cloud? That's often a question that goes back and forth, especially when you're trying to implement something like maybe service control policies. Because service control policy is kind of that, little bit of a cleaver of saying no access. You can have conditional exceptions, but what are you going to have, accepted? I think that's a question that organizations tend to struggle on, because if you're migrating a very open group that maybe doesn't use pipelines, now you start to get into the question of how do we control identity within the organization, right? Like, yeah, AWS org, SCPs, policy orientation. Bring your lunchbox. Make dinner plans, or throw out your dinner plans, depending on how you're doing it. Pizza is always good, right? Because it's pineapple for you, Dell. But I think part of it is getting into that rhythm of just understanding, hey, we have to take this one step at a time, but we want to make sure we continue to take those steps forward while staying on known patterns and known, let's say, ways of working. So we can identify and know our own security maturity level so that we can continue to build upon it. And that kind of leads you into the first question. As you're going through, and we're running through the speed run of the different topics and shows and things of that nature we covered in the past, I think the one area is, hey, when you think of what capability was the hardest to learn from, what is it? Is it AWS IAM, permission boundaries, data perimeter, S3 security, KMS? It's interesting, right? Because sometimes you think it's going to be, right there, but you turn around and it's like, hey, how did that policy get up there? How did we do that? I don't know. And those are the things that we're trying to figure out together. But feel free to put 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the chat. I'm always curious to know what everybody's kind of hardest uptake part is, because we can dive a little bit, deeper into it. But I always like to start at world 1-1. Add network in there. Agent, Kampachi, I felt that. I felt your tone of typing from that. That is the important part. And is there all of the above? It is interesting, because when you try to say, hey, which is the hardest part, usually there's a technical aspect, there's a governance aspect, and then there is a place where business and technical try to meet. And it looks like number one is where they meet with IAM and permission boundaries. Say, hey, we have to have access to this in order to have our application do X, Y, and Z. Okay, but do you need full admin access to do that? Well, we need to do this now for the short term. And that short term is never the short term. It usually turns into the long term. And the longer term, until something happens or something occurs. And it's like, hey, why did this role exist in an exemption that exempted us from our tagging policy, exempted us from, having IAM roles denied from being attached? Those are the kind of questions that come up. And I think part of the place to start out is just understanding where you are. What is your current maturity level? And I think that's also an interesting place just to stop and think about it. Because if you're trying to figure out what your maturity is, hey, it's dangerous to go alone. So take a friend, like the security maturity model. Because how do you prioritize the different items that come across your desk, right? And priorities is, bolded. And I think that's bolded intentionally. And wait, quick wins. And these are some of the fun aspects to think about. What are some of the quick wins that we can do? And we kind of started with these in our World 1-1 episode. Feel free to go back and look on YouTube and Twitch, right? Because you start to think about, okay, security governance. This is usually a topic that takes a little bit because you're assigning security contacts. Who wants to own what? What regions are we able to use in, right? And yeah, seems to go for a long time. Yeah, exactly. And yes, it is very cool because if you start with the governance aspects of, okay, if we were to break this down into the simple items of where are we hosting our items, what region, right, are we trying to build in? And usually sometimes, organizations have different regulatory requirements, frameworks that they have to apply to. And maybe we just host everything in, North America or Asia or wherever the case may be, based on where our businesses are, where our contracts are. That's the other thing that's sometimes overlooked of saying, hey, certain contracts designate that, hey, you're not supposed to host over here or host over there, right? So how do you account for that within your target state security strategy? So to Dell's point, that you don't get stuck in -1, right? Where the screen doesn't look quite right. What is happening? And that's where you start to develop, okay, we have an understanding of some of the baseline components, some of the security governance items that we need to have into place so that we can start to move down the chain and get another quick win with identity access management. Do we have the MFAs? Do we have the root account protection? Do we have identity federation? OIDC, I'm looking at you. So when you start to think about these items, you start to develop some of the quick foundational items of going from that green field to a guardrail, work in progress for that name. But what we're trying to essentially get to is understanding that, hey, we're starting out with the overarching items, the little conversational pieces, so we can continue to move forward in such a way that now if we know the regions, we know some multi-factor, we have somewhat of a landing zone, maybe we should consider the control tower where we plan on growing. We plan on starting secure. So why don't we stand up a secure multi-account landing zone from day one? It can include the OU structure. It can include an account factory. It can orchestrate, do all the things that we needed to do. And then that way we have mandatory and I would say strongly recommended guardrails that we can put into place with service control policies from the preventative side, and then roll them out with some, detective controls also in place with config rules. And once you have that control tower, now you can start to think about how do we continue to enhance. And that's where we walk through the landing zone accelerator of how it can help with some of that centralized networking that was brought up, and as well as just saying, hey, how can we deploy org-wide configs from, let's say, YAML files, right, into a code pipeline so that we can have version controls. We can have all these different mechanisms put into place and built to our specifications. And there's also, templates and landing zone accelerator that you can use with different pieces in mind. It's like, hey, we have HIPAA or PCI or certain frameworks that we need to adhere to. Well, there's some examples, some known patterns that you can use. Because if you start to look at the bigger picture of where you go from identity in your quick wins, you start to go to some threat detection, detecting your common threats. Do you have the guard duties? Do you have the full visibility with Security Hub and config and detective and so on and so forth? So it's funny that it starts out with the quick wins, but when you start to think about control tower, I can enable services that help me with these quick wins. So it's kind of like, it's like a double rainbow. If you get that reference, 10 billion points to you. you start to think about it in a different way. So guard duty, if we take that step, we had an episode when we discussed guard duty and how it applies ML and threat intelligence to and against CloudTrail, VPC full logs, DNS logs. And which logs do you include? Well, I would say find out in a previous episode. We're doing a speed run today, any percent. So we're covering the high level topics. But to make it simple, look at a threat detection incident response guide. That's a place to start to figure out which logs you keep and which ones are important for threat detection and incident response. And after you go down that route, you start to think about a little bit more of how do I continue to tighten up? Now that I have some of the enhancements in place, think about service control policies. These are the maximum permission ceiling for the entire OU. It blocks dangerous actions before they execute. And these are usually the baselines that you put into place. Why? Because if you look at service control policies, and there's RCPs as well, but just let's stick there for a second. If you have an OU and you are structured in such a way that you have your workloads, now you can put your workloads, you split it into non-production, production, then you can have inherited service control policies as baselines that are carried out. You can have tagging policies carried out. Now you have a fundamental start of, hey, these are the baseline requirements for our environment. It's important. It's powerful because what it happens to do, unintentionally, intentionally, is change and shift your organization's mindset to thinking about, okay, what really needs to go into our baseline? What needs to be applied in a certain way? And I think enforcing that least privileged mentality helps to think about identity within the organization, permission boundaries, session policies. How do you limit the overall reach of if something were to happen within your environment, what do they have access to? And that's where we started out. And as you continue to go down the quick wins, infrastructure protection, risky ports. And you know how you can help, security groups and everything along those lines, but you can start to put in some, service control policies, some SCPs into place for that as well. Blocking public access. Who has the rights to unblock public access within your organization? Is it anybody who says, hey, this is too hard for us? Or is there a cab in place, right? Where you have a change board where it says, hey, any major changes to this extent, we have to put through a certain process. Anything else is just PRs that we go through that we update. That's how you get past World 1-1 to World 1-4. These are the fundamentals that we started to put into place. That's how you clear this stage, this level, or levels, I should say, because this is where the defense in depth foundation comes into play. This is where the governance, visibility, and prevention are all equipped before you even face, a potential threat. It's layered controls. So that means one single misconfiguration is caught before it kind of gets, let's say, acted upon. Because if you have all these steps in place, the service control policy, the RCPs, the permission boundaries, you're already setting the maximum level of permissions. You're already granting certain groups the access to do certain things within the organization. You're creating that division of duties with your identity structure. Because this is how starting out with this fundamental baseline starts to help you go down a certain path, right? I'm already down one heart talking about all this fun stuff. But now, if we look at the grander scheme, we started 1-1 to 1-4. What is 2? What is World 2 within this? Well, it's continuing to lock down identity. Identity comes back up multiple times. I say identity 3 times for people on the other side of the interwebs because it's an important factor. Because we spoke about service control policy, but permission boundaries, we also touched upon in a previous episode because this is what delegates access safely and prevents privilege escalation. So Why is that important? Well, most of the time, the argument for a developer is, hey, we're trying to move fast, so we just need administrative access to do what we need to do. We do not want to stand in the way, but we want to put into place guardrails or boundaries that can help enable the developer self-service. So a managed policy attached to a principal sets the maximum permissions, right? That means this is the most that they can ever have. And there's power to that because now you don't have to worry as much, because regardless of their identity-based policies, they already have defined the maximum. So they don't have to, worry about, hey, we are doing this within their environment. We have administrative access. Well, you also have a permission boundary that says you can't elevate your privilege. So thank you. Have fun developing your application, because you started to think about your overarching guardrails and tried to make a square. I made an octagon for whatever reason, but I digress. Because when you have the effective permissions, you start to think about, okay, how do I go about this so that if you have an intersection between your boundary and identity policy, you want to make sure that neither alone can ever exceed the other one. And that's part of the conversation and part of the next steps that you take when you go to World 2. This is what enables safe delegated admin. Developers can create roles only if they have the attached boundary in place. And the truth. And yes, I like this. This is my favorite coffee cup, right? Because it tells me when I need more coffee. So when you start to think about the advanced next step of this, you start to go along the edge cases. And this is how you start to learn how boundaries interact with SEPs and session policies and cross-account roles at scale. And this is where you start to go into the next step of discussions. This is where you start to think about, all right, I'm kind of out of the quick wins section. And I'm starting to get more into, hey, we have to figure out, hey, we did this stuff. What's next on our list? How do we make sure that there's a full evaluation chain in place? How do we figure out that, okay, if we have SEP, boundary, identity policy, session policy with an explicit deny overriding all, what does that do within my organization? How do I even think about that? If I have cross-account assume role that I would say evaluates the boundary in the target account and not the calling account, now you're starting to speak in where are we going and where are we coming from. And that's an important kind of recognition to think about. Because when you start to speed up, now you start to think, okay, we just need to assume this role that does it, but what are you doing when you do that? And what services are you doing for? What identities are you doing for? Are you doing for human identity or machine identity? And this is where you start to continue to go down that route that we were speaking about with something like the data perimeter, where you start to build organizational wild force fields across the identity, resource, and the network to stop data exfiltration. So what goes into that? Well, identity, you think of your principal org ID, resource org ID, your source VPC, and then you have the enforcement mechanism through the SEPs and the RCPs, the VPC endpoint policies, all of these combined, and you start to go down that route. So if you start to think about this in this way, you start to understand, hey, we have a lot to cover within the baseline. But as we take it step by step, it's slowly, get a little bit easier because we're speeding up as we're doing this. We're thinking about, okay, we have the identity, the networking. What about the data perimeter as we were going down that path? How are we handling S3 security, right? How are we encrypting? How are we handling object ownership? All these type of things. Well, easy route is, one, just have a spec-driven design, but two, just think about it and take a step back of how you're trying to approach your goals. How does this bucket have sensitive information? Does it have logging information? We have all these different pieces that we set up, especially from a centralized landing zone standpoint. Usually you have a centralized logging archive account, and then that's where your logs go, and then that goes over into your overall workflow of your SIM and your long-term storage, so on and so forth. But the idea behind this is just taking a second to map all those pieces out. In order to clear the level, it's not just, hey, we encrypted this, but we also need to think about data loss prevention. We need to think about, hey, can we operate? How can we make config and Macy? How can we have automated remediations to scale data protection enterprise-wide? These are all pieces of the puzzle that we start to think about. And if there's a permissive bucket policy, well, was it even part of the original design? If I take that step back, what I'm trying to say is, how are they able to allow a permissive bucket? And that's where those foundational pieces. So when you have that layered trust model, you start to think about, okay, that one misconfiguration, it won't end up running because you have all these pieces in play. And I know it's a lot to go through. It's a lot to think about. Well, the easiest way to go about this is to think about it from this perspective. Is you're not the first one to go down this path. There's quite a few legends, as I would say, with known security patterns. And that's kind of where we jump into our segment, as SideQuest legend has it. I'll work on my announcer voice, but it's somewhat there. What I have to make up for it is some good old SideQuest board music. So as you go through, Dell's got it. Yes, S3. Rarely mentioned. EFS, FXS. Yes. So, as SideQuest legend has it, I know you're wondering, why is the music? What is kicking up? What is happening? Well, this is the segment in our show where we dive into some customer stories and we start to think about it from the perspective of, hey, if we have an AWS environment, what is the customer story behind it? Well, we have the SideQuest board to kind of chart us through a visualization of it. So let's dive in. We have our typical setup where, hey, we have our authenticated users, we have our unauthenticated users, and we have our fictitious company. Let's say this company, Meridian Works, sounds fictitious enough, because let's say after migrating their connected factory platform, their pipelines, their global supply chain telemetry to AWS, maybe they spent their time building out their centralized logging, their detection mechanisms. Now they were able to scale. They were able to build their organization. They went from a few factories to 38 smart factories across 14 countries. They have petabytes of data. Maybe, let's say, 27 petabytes of data. Making a nice number. They have to follow frameworks, the ISOs, the PCI DSS. Okay, they built their security program one capability at a time. So it seems good, right? All is well. And if I had cloudy, stormy music, I would play it. But let's say on a regular day, they have all the different metrics tracks. You know, they have the logging, they have the detection that works. But something happened. The room went quiet one day when they were recapping a potential incident. They thought every capability was excellent. Well, there was a gap. There was a loop that was never closed. And why was that loop never closed? Well, they tried to put together that narrative. There was insufficient evidence to close a loop and improve their security posture. Why? Because there was somebody dwelling within their environment. And with that potential threat dwelling, questions started to arise of how come we didn't detect? What did they change? How do we know if they changed anything? And that's when they started to think about their overarching maturity cycle. And they started to think about, all right, let's go to exactly that, the logs. So me being a log person, I can start at the VPC flow logs. I can start at the CloudTrail logs. But I think part of the conversation is, do we have all the different mechanisms and tools configured in such a way? Because if we have CloudTrail logs, that individual would have been picked up. Or would it? What triggered? What went off? Was there any type of functions that said, hey, as this user who's unauthorized access our network, I play Lambda face up. 10 billion points if you get that reference. So a Lambda triggers. What does that Lambda do? Does it build a certain mechanism? Does it build out your a pipeline of remediations that happen? Does it shut down? Does it isolate instances? I think this is worth a conversation, because the other piece of this is you can start to think about it of, hey, maybe we have something like Security Hub that's also taking into account the different log pieces from CloudTrail and the other sources to say, hey, there's potential activity, there's something happening within the environment that we need to act upon. This is kind of where the questions start to come in, because you start to question each stage of the process because they thought they had everything in place. Now, that's where that question comes up. Who built every stage of the process? How did they prove what connected and what didn't? Well, the only way is to maybe say, hey, how can we test this out? Maybe we can have some chaos experiments to validate response paths that don't match their actual production detections, to come up with hypothesis, or come up with a hypothesis to say, hey, what if somebody were to enter our environment this way? Would this trigger an alarm? What did we review? What did we enact from our post-incident kind of report? These are all questions that we start to ask. And this is where you usually get that feeling of, all right, we didn't close the loop somewhere, and something led to a misconfiguration within our environment somewhere. And feel free to put in the chat if you've ever experienced this before, where you had that I didn't close the loop moment, and you started to hear a different type of music play, right? Because it's that recognition of, hey, that thing we said and we put onto our backlog for later is actually the same misconfiguration that caused 2 incidents. But the lesson was never made. We have petabytes of logs and detection mechanisms, but we do not have an automated response. So that prolonged, that gave excess dwell time. And that's where we take that stop, that quiet. That's when we hit the pause game button and we take that step back to realize, hey, there's a lot that we have to think about, because we thought we had all the different detection steps in place, the detection mechanisms. Now you're saying we are missing something. Well, good thing we got that Zach Morris timeout, as I call it, because we can dive in to the world of logging, detection, and automated response, the encounter loop. Right? We thought this previous organization had centralized logging. How do you build a centralized logging? Hey, do you have tamper-proof log archives? Do you have MFA delete? Do you have integrity validation? These are all questions that start to come out. And as we speed run to our security profile, now we start to think about, okay, if I have a dedicated log archive account that isolates evidence from the accounts that it generates, that helps to prevent attacks. We have CloudTrail log file validation, and maybe even S3 object locks. But how do we turn the billions of events, maybe the tens of billions of events, into a high fidelity detection hypothesis driven methodology pipeline? I think it starts with the actual hypothesis, right? You start to get to the place of, hey, we need to figure out if we were going down the route of automation within our environment, then we need to figure out, what are we trying to protect against? Is it STS credential exfiltration? Do we map to something like the MITRE framework or Stride or something in between that? I think that's all pieces of the puzzle, right? So the next steps of this is to think about the different hypotheses for your environment. So if you start to go down that route, that's where we delved in previous episodes on how to create a threat hypothesis, right? This is how we start to develop our different ways of thinking and designing our alerts, because now we start to identify maybe custom threats or custom threat lists within something like GuardDuty, and we start to have different event bridge patterns and rules, and we start to figure out, hey, now we can automate our response in such a way that is beneficial. It helps out. We contain threats in seconds with something like a step function. We can trigger different, let's say, runbooks of the SSM variety. These are powerful tools that we need to continue to take on and evaluate and think about. What are our response primitives? Our IAM credentials, do we revoke them? Do we have EC2 security groups quarantine? Do we perform tabletops to figure out these are the items that we need to do, and these are how we come up with a hypothesis to protecting our environment? That's where I take the dramatic pause. Take a sip of the coffee and figure out, what is the balance between those automated mechanisms and having a human in the loop approval gate to protect high impact actions? This is where the balance comes in between your mean time to contain, your mean time to respond, and coming up with the balance of, before something's even pushed out, we have an approval gate. But what we were discussing in early episodes, and even earlier this episode, is giving the developer power to do certain things within the environment. But this is where your automation has to keep up with that same mentality. Is if something were to happen, what are your triggers? What is your path, right? So if a GuardDuty finding were to trigger something like an event bridge rule, what are the next steps? And do those next steps meet your overarching target goals, your KPIs? Because you have to measure it against something. Because security automation, you can build self-healing controls, event-driven remediation. You can build out the step functions, right? So these are the key pieces. And Dell mentions, I would imagine anything involving identity, credentials, privileges, policies, and changes, there need to be some type of monitoring. Yes, 100%. There needs to be some type of monitoring. And there also needs to be something triggering with that monitoring. Because if it picks it up and it's monitored, is that going to wait and go into a queue where somebody's going to manually take a run book and look through and say, hey, if this alert comes in, I am supposed to isolate instance. Okay, great. Let me go do that. That's already a lot of time, because now that individual has to look in the run book, figure out, if they're not that familiar with how to isolate an instance, do they even have pre-created security groups? Maybe create those. That's part of the run book steps. And then log into the console, do all of that. That can be easily 10 to 20 minutes of going through. And that's after the little bit of time it takes for that alert to trigger and go through your steps. Or you can have some type of security automation where you have something like config rules that detect drift and trigger something like an AWS SSM automation document, right? To autocorrect misconfigurations before it becomes something larger within your organization. And the other piece of this, which is going to be spoilers for a future episode, is agentic AI and how you can have this built in within your DevSecOps mindset and your workflows, right? How can you level up your overarching policies, procedures by having maybe some type of agents within your environment that can help triage, prioritize, remediate? How can you put some guardrails and make sure humans are in a loop with those as well? Because these are all parts of the puzzle that you have to piece together, especially when you're thinking of your overarching target state security strategy. Because, hey, we're trying to speed run and build and develop. There are tools to help you do this. You just have to leverage them, right? Yeah, a slight preview, a little preview. It's a little trailer where it's just, it shows, pops on the screen, and it's like, security agent, next episode, and then disappears, right? Security agent will return. I'll use that. But these are the ways that you start to go through and check the different items off your mental list of, hey, I need to think about this. And the great part with AWS, you also have the managed services. So, it's an optional summon that you can do for managed services. So you start to figure out, hey, maybe we can offload some of the operational overhead while maintaining the security compliance posture by having something like AMS in place, right? That can help with the patch management, the incident management, the compliance automation, while we've tried to figure out the larger pieces of our overarching architecture, design, and workflows and processes and compliance metrics, little things, right? These are all different pieces of the puzzle, how you clear this stage. This is how you close the loops so that our customer story doesn't, come to pass, where you think you have everything in place. This is defining mechanisms so you can refine and have the different workflows that you can continue to think about, to speak about, to talk about. Every other version of that. I heard it both ways. Now, the next question is, when you're thinking about your overarching security program, what breaks first in your security program? This is where I would insert, the heart, because that's how it kind of feels, right? When you think about what breaks first, is it logging gaps? Is it low fidelity detections with alert fatigue? Is it manual, slower responsive where somebody has to roll out the security runbook scroll? Or is it just we don't have real forensic capabilities, so it takes us a while to think about these items? Feel free to put 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the chat as you start to think about that. When I think about this, what I've seen is, one, a combination between 1 and 2, where 1 leads to 2, or 1 doesn't exist, so 2, you don't really get that, right? Where you have some of the logging gaps of not understanding what logs to capture, what logs to maintain, and how you overarchingly handle logs within your environment. So if you have control tower and you have a centralized logging archiving account, okay, where do those logs go next? Do they go to your SIM? Do they go to, let's say, a long-term storage like a security lake or a Cribble or something along those lines before it gets somewhere? Or do you do some type of transformation? Do you search using like a Athena and Glue combination onto that S3 bucket where the centralized logs are, so you could do some ad hoc querying? So it's interesting how this takes place, right? So we kind of have a split between slow response and logging gaps, which is interesting because it's a little bit of both that sometimes comes in. There's no right answer to this, but it is the type of thing that starts to make you think a bit. Because how do you get to the point where, 1, you say hi, but 2, you start to also think about, what does a victory lap look like for us? for security, what does a victory lap look like? Well, I would say it's the validation, the forensics, the continuous improvement. That's how we get to it. And part of that conversation is with maybe some chaos engineering. I know, chaos engineering. But hear me out. Prove your pipelines work. Inject controlled attack scenarios. You use fault injection. You can use some way to validate your detections fire and contains different items. Because I think it's all part of the way of how you start to think about your environment. So if you take that step back, okay, we validate maybe event bridge triggers, step function completes, Lambda remediates. The other half of this is figuring out that you need to investigate what's happening. Do you have cloud forensics? This is a step that's often overlooked because do users within your organization, both admin and not, do they know how to preserve evidence? Think about something like an EBS snapshot. Think about immutable logs. Think about just chain of custody as a whole. This is something we touched upon because if you were to try and analyze your snapshots, do they exist in an isolated forensics account? It's a good question, right? Dramatic pause. Are you able to leverage something like detective for your behavioral graphs and finding groups to understand, hey, when something happened, do you understand the full path across all your accounts of what triggered, when and what and how? Are you leveraging any tools? Are you leveraging any teams? When something did happen, like maybe CERT, the customer incident response team, where they help partner with you to understand what is happening during active incidents, where they can leverage some tools to help you out. And I think the lesson learned from when you're dealing with this, whether it's a tabletop exercise, a real event, or just going through your process and procedures, is you have to run blameless post-incident reviews and codify findings in order to help build up stronger detection, stronger runbooks, stronger use, right? Because when you start to build up the muscle memory, you start to say, hey, I know what happened in this. This is how we're going to close the loop on different things, because a blameless review focuses on the systematic root cause rather than the individual fault of saying, hey, this person added this extra stuff to a PR, or this person, accepted this PR to start off with. And the codification helps you to track and log and build something into your programs so that you can continue to grow your organizational program, especially around security. And that helps to build the North Star for your overarching, I would say, your company and your team and everything in between that. And you know what builds upon that? Threat hypothesis. Right? It's like, how do we do this? Well, our North Star is this. Let's come up with some questions to ask. Let's figure out what our current program maturity model is. That's what we started at the beginning, right? If we were to figure out our maturity model, we can figure out where we are. We can figure out how we need to upskill within our organization. We can also figure out, hey, how can we build up something like, the good old certificate knowledge as we put up first before we put up the good old, knowledge quest knowledge. And knowledge quest knowledge, what is that? Well, that's when you kind of take that step back and you start to try and build some aura and figure out how we can elevate our presence, how we can reinforce our overall security lifecycle while speedrunning, AWS security. So the best place to start out with that is mentioning, hey, we all start out L100, right? You're an E-tank apprentice, right? Your energy tank is just starting out. You can't take in all the information at once. So you got to take those small steps. You got to figure out, what are those, what do you call it? Quick wins. These are the items that you start to delve into when you're an E-tank apprentice. The vulnerability management, the infrastructure protection, everything in between. Then you start to get down the line of, okay, I can delve into what Security Hub CSPM is. Okay, there's a cloud security posture management, there's security hub. What are the difference? What are the different concepts? This is where you delve into what you're trying to define within your organization. You can work through the different pieces. And then eventually you can get to understanding something like security lake. You can get to understanding, hey, how do I leverage step functions? I'm used to just lambdas triggering. But if I really take that step back, and if I'm that L100 personality that's trying to just figure out, hey, I just want to trigger if something happens within my environment, do this. Well, the funny thing about that is when you start to level up, you start to think about it a little bit differently. You start to power up a little bit differently. You know why? Because you start to get to the point of saying, I just don't want one item to happen. I want multiple items to happen because we're trying to level up our entire policy and presence. And the best way to do this is figuring out, okay, what is security incident response? This is how you power up. This is how you get your repetitions in. Because you start to understand what are the patterns, what are the things they have to look out for, what are the log sources that you need to go through, right? What is AWS fault injection service? We spoke about chaos engineering. This is a big piece of it. But the other side of that is this is validating your pipelines. This is validating your experiences. This is validating that I set this up correctly, which is the question that goes through everybody's head, right? And then if something were to happen, you can reconstruct the entire timeline of events. This is where detective comes in. And this is how detective is used. Because you can imagine, take that break to speak about video games, is how do you get better at beating the boss? Well, you start to understand their patterns. And you replay it multiple times, step by step, understanding their behaviors. And this is where detective comes in. If you were to correlate that together, detective understands step-by-step behavioral graphs, finding groups. It connects the forensics evidence pieces together back to the original detection so that you can say, hey, I kind of observed every way this can go, I think. Now let's start to think about this in a different way. And I also have other pieces of technology I could go through. We're speed running through this, right? We could do query access. We could do systems manager incident response where you can say, hey, built-in post-incident analysis. Great. But it all starts here. What is AWS security incident response? How do we think about it? That's how you start to build up your level so that you say, hey, I'm somewhat of a security professional myself. I'm somewhat of the final stage architect. And what is a final stage architect? Well, it's a person who understands the architecture of their organization because they built it piece by piece. I would say brick by brick. And how did they do so? Well, they started to maybe follow known patterns. They started to look at items like maybe the security reference architecture and say, hey, what are the foundational building blocks that I need to become that final stage architect? What are the different pieces of the puzzle? How can I do this securely? Well, if we're talking about an organizational unit, start small. Say, what services are we leveraging? Do we have a management account? Do we have a security account? Do we have an infrastructure? Do we have all these different pieces? Do you understand even where our workloads are? and what we use for our workloads. And when it comes to understanding the, let's say, SCPs, if we even were to go back down to that concept, okay, service control policies, how do we understand maybe these services we haven't had time to review as an organization to say, hey, are our individuals upskilled enough to leverage these services? Is our security mature enough to leverage these services? Now we can start to think of service control policies and say, hey, these 50 services will enable for now, and then the rest of them will go through a process of reviewing them. And then that process involves creating service control policies and limitations, identity, who's going to understand and leverage these services, so that when we architect and understand the workloads, we can say, okay, we are okay because we have these different pieces in play. We have these boundaries. We also have a sandbox. I always often like to say it and take that pause too to say, use your experimental OU. What is your experimental OU? It's basically that place where you experiment. It has some policies in place and protections, but the main place is disconnected from your entire environment, and it's just places to experiment. I digress. Because when you're a final stage architect, you start to go through the different pieces. One, so you understand, your stage that you architect. But two, you often want to understand from an audit readiness program standpoint, from an auditing continuous improvement standpoint, to say, hey, we have these metrics. We know how we close the loops. We know that this is a cycle that continues on and on. And part of it is every step of the way, you want to be energized about it. Because the reason why this episode is titled Any Percent is you can literally start at any percent when it comes to your security maturity level, but you always get to play on New Game Plus. You always get to go through and continue to increase, to build up your guardrails, your identity structures, your overarching logging detection threat, all those kind of pieces of the puzzle. You also get to do one thing that's important, and that's continue to build out the incident response plan as I channel my inner Russ. And you can also come back next week as we look forward a little bit and discuss maybe something of the security agent variety. But until then, feel free, reach out, say hi, and let us know what you're working on. Because it's always fun to level up yourself 1 XP point at a time. And then what happens after you level up? Well, an achievement unlocks, and you have overarchingly level up your community and your organization. So until next time, have fun. Happy Monday. Take care. Cheers.